everybody to our session today on how to support a friend, family member, or colleague who is suffering in the context of the pandemic. And in the context, I think, of Kata Weingarten is going to talk some more about this, but about this sort of the state of the world in general right now as well. So this session developed out of a really wonderful session that Kata Weingarten, our faculty person, put together on grief. That was, some of you may have had the opportunity to attend that a couple weeks ago. And it was a really incredible conversation, sharing of resources, and out of that really was a desire to sort of move to the next sort of point, I guess, of supporting other people as well as addressing your own emotions in the context of what's been happening. So I want to welcome all of you, and to let you know that this session will be accredited for nurses. We also can provide a certificate of attendance to anyone who wishes to receive one. The evaluation for the whole session will pop up at the end, and we encourage everybody to fill it out. But especially if you want to receive a certificate, you have to fill one out so that we know that you need it. And finally, I know Kate is going to talk about this in more depth, but we don't have audio enabled. But we want this to be a highly interactive session, so really encourage you to use the chat, the question and answer section if you need to. My colleague Martha Alvarado and I will be monitoring that, and we'll be bringing up those issues or any questions that you have as we go along. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Kata Weingarten, who will take us on from here.
Thank you, Jillian and Martha. I know you're there as well. So thank you for joining the webinar today. And more than anything, I just hope it can be helpful to you. And there are a number of points that I want to make before I start showing the slides. As Jillian has said, this has been an incredibly challenging and painful 2.5 weeks. And this particular webinar was put together directly after a webinar that I led on May 20th. So days before the events in Minneapolis. And I absolutely could not have predicted, anticipated how painful the time was going to be, how much turmoil the country, the world was going to be in. So I've gone over the slides many, many times to see or get a sense of whether the material is going to be pertinent for this exact moment that we're in. And I think it will be, but you'll be able to let us know. I can't possibly know how each person is feeling who's attending the webinar. But I'm going to make an assumption that it's been a very upsetting time for you. And as Jillian said, I'm going to be pausing throughout the webinar to ask questions that people can give answers to on the chat, so that we get a sense that we are in some form of shared community, even though obviously it's a virtual shared community. But we're here, we're meant to be together through this time. And one of the things that I always say is, we're all taking this webinar in a body, and it's really important that you pay attention to the cues you're getting from your body, and you take care of yourself. And if that means you need to step away because something is upsetting, do that. The webinar is going to be archived. It'll be available. You can always catch up on any part that you miss or skip over. There's sort of 3 simple things that I also recommend for people. If you find that you're starting to get upset, you can, and I'm doing it right now, you can plant your feet on the ground and just really feel your feet. The other is you can take a really good deep breath in and let it out. And then finally, there's the butterfly hug, which I really love. And you just cross your arms and wiggle your fingers, and it does a lot physiologically, which I could explain, but it's really not necessary. I think it looks adorable and it feels so good. So as I said,
Just real quick, just a small piece. If there's something rubbing against your microphone periodically,
Okay.
not sure where that's coming from, but it's just giving you some noise. It's
Okay, sorry. How is it now?
well, let's just give it a go. See how it goes.
Okay. So again, one of the contexts here, I think, is that this has been a very upsetting time. And in addition to those physiologic things that we can do, the butterfly hug, grounding ourselves with our feet, taking a deep breath, I also think there are a couple of ways that we can remember ourselves. And one is to kind of travel back in time and think of yourself as a child and try to get a sense of appreciation of what you can recall about yourself as a child to help you account for how much you care now. And that's a way of anchoring ourselves in the continuity of our being caring people. And a second thing is that whatever it is, whatever the really intense emotion that you're feeling now, or a combination of emotions, whether it's rage or grief or sadness or just pure pain, it's important to remember that there is a full person who is feeling those feelings, and that you are not the same as those feelings. You are not the grief. You are not the pain. You are not the rage. You are a person experiencing those. So with that, and Jillian, was that better in terms of the whatever's on the microphone?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so that's me. Now you're seeing me. So again, I've said something about the context of the present moment, but I want to make another point, which is that when I put together the slides for this webinar, I was really thinking that people who would be attending would be positioning themselves as a person wanting to support someone else. But in a way, that's not fully realistic anymore. So I think it's probable that most of you are going to be having a kind of a dual awareness as we go through the slides, thinking about these ideas for yourself as well as for somebody else who might be a friend, a neighbor, a family member, a colleague, somebody you care about. And I am going to pause and just ask for people to put into the chat whether what is foremost on your mind is the pandemic, racism, or both. And I don't mean that to be a forced choice, but if you have a sense, we'll just take a moment to see what's top of your mind right now. Are you getting any responses, Jillian?
Looks like the majority of people are putting both. We have a few that have just put pandemic, and maybe one or two that have entered racism.
Okay, so I'm imagining that, or I'm going to be going through this with an appreciation or an awareness of it, the present moment. You're here, you're coming here, and you're having strong feelings about both. And the person who you may want to support is likely also to be somebody who's having strong feelings about both. So just I'm with you. I'm clear on that. And here, given that one of the things that's been happening is that we are aware of huge racial disparities in well-being. This came from a policy brief from California, which was where I was at the time, on June 3rd. And here, I mean, you can read this, but we're just looking at the number of areas in which there are racial disparities that have a direct impact on well-being. So criminal justice, health, income and wealth, higher unemployment, and academics. And here again, this is something that provides a context marker for all of us, that the percentage of workers employed in frontline essential jobs by race and ethnicity in California as of 2018, and as I'm sure you've been reading the newspapers and know, that not all states do supply data broken down by race and ethnicity. And in not doing so, race and ethnicity factors related to well-being are rendered less visible. They are obscured. And you can see the disparities here. So, you know, my work over the last 20 years has been about witnessing. And this is a grid that I've used in multiple situations to account for what happens to us when we are a witness. And one of it's a combination, the witness theory that I'm putting forward takes trauma theory and bystander theory. And it says, look, people, the term bystander typically means that you're kind of uninvolved. That's what it means to be a bystander. But in fact, we all know, I think, and certainly the last 2.5 weeks has made it abundantly clear that it can be highly traumatizing when you are a witness to something. And anybody who saw the video or even heard accounts of the video could well have been in a horrendous position as a witness. So now, in the context of this webinar, I'm saying, okay, almost everybody probably on this webinar who's attending had an experience of being a witness to something that was traumatizing. And then what do we do about it? And in addition, you may also be a witness to a friend or family member or colleague who's also having a terrible reaction, was traumatized by the events of the last 2.5 weeks. This particular organization of the grid is saying, okay, the color scheme is based on a traffic light. We want to be, as a witness, we want to be in an aware and empowered position. We want to be in, I'm just going to say in terms of, let's say, a friend. We want to be aware and empowered in relation to our friend because we want to be supportive. We want to be helpful. We want to be attuned. We want to be thoughtful. We want to be helpful. And that's the whole webinar today, is really geared with ideas, with suggestions, and you're going to participate. The things that you know and are doing to be attuned and thoughtful and helpful when you are a witness to another person's distress. We want to avoid at all costs being in the red square. We don't want to be critical, hurtful, or cruel. And when that happens, people are witnesses, but they're empowered in some way. They can make a comment, but they're clueless, they're unaware, and so they end up sometimes inadvertently, hopefully, but occasionally intentionally being hurtful or being cruel. It's also possible just to kind of bury your head in the sand, have a friend you know is distressed and you just feel overwhelmed by it. You don't know what to do. And so you withdraw and you just opt out of the situation. And again, this webinar is intended to help people move up into the green square to try to manage their own discomfort or uneasiness or uncertainty, which is in the yellow square, feeling confused, I don't know what to do, to find ways so that we can kind of all be our most helpful, attuned, thoughtful selves in that green square. And so that's what we're going to be looking at today. They're sort of aids, if you will, to help us get there, to certainly move out of the red square, not be tempted into the bottom right square of kind of just opting out, and registering when we feel uncertain and kind of figuring out what's in our toolkit. What's our best bet to help us move into the green square? Now, we're going to look at this slide again. And this also comes from an article that will be one of the resources that you'll get at the end of the webinar. And it's a really simple idea. And in a way, it's a shortcut through way more complex kind of terms or ways of thinking about, you know, how to support somebody. Basically, what it is saying is that the person who you want to support is the center, in the center dot, where there's an arrow. It says the aggrieved or afflicted. So that could be somebody who's ill with COVID. It can be somebody who's terrified for their family, but that is the person you want to support. And then there are these concentric rings. Maybe the next ring is the circle is the person who's closest to that person, and then next closest and next closest and next closest. And what this is saying is that when you are moving out from an interior ring outward, you get to say whatever you want. You can dump out. But if you're in a outer ring and you're making a comment to somebody who is in a ring closer in a smaller circle, your job is to offer comfort. So that's comfort in and dump out, depending on where you are in relationship to the person you are interacting with. And that's kind of a shorthand, I would say, for everything you need to know that will come out of the webinar. Dump out and comfort in. So now we're going to talk about empathy. I'm going to move to ideas about compassion. Empathy refers to the capacity to understand and respond to the unique emotional experiences of another person. And empathy is a really important characteristic, way of feeling, way of interacting. But empathy is not just one experience. And it turns out that there are at least 4 different psychological states that make up empathy. So we can imagine how we ourselves would think and feel in another situation or in that person's shoes. Or we can imagine how the other person thinks or feels given his or her situation. We can feel as another person feels, or we can have feelings for another person who is in need. These are quite distinct situations. And it turns out that if you are imagining how another person feels, or imagine how you yourself would feel, those are different forms of perspective taking, and they have different consequences. So if you imagine how another person feels, it's likely to evoke empathic concern. But if you imagine how you yourself would feel in that person's situation, not only does it usually evoke empathic concern, but it could also evoke personal distress. And my guess is that most people taking this webinar have had that experience, because empathic concern is likely to inspire a desire to help the other person. But personal distress that gets evoked through empathy is likely to lead to actions to reduce your own distress, and that can also even lead to withdrawal. So that's a really important distinction. And it turns out that if we are putting ourselves in another person's shoes, if we're imagining that or feeling the way they would feel, it has the potential for stirring up our own personal distress, leading us to be less helpful to our friends. So I'm sure most of you have, or many of you have heard the term compassion fatigue. And compassion doesn't fatigue. What can fatigue is the form of empathy that I was just discussing, where there's also personal distress. And yes, of course, it can get too much. So in general, we want to have the form of empathy that helps us imagine what another person is feeling. And we also want to develop compassion. Compassion is an awareness of suffering, caring about that person, a genuine wish to help that person relieve their suffering, and a willingness to take action to do that. So I'm going to pause here and just see whether or not this distinction between forms of empathy, where some forms of empathy actually lead towards so much distress that you withdraw from the person. Is that something that's familiar to people? Either you're the person who's withdrawn, or you've had somebody withdraw from you. So kind of a yes, no, familiar, not familiar.
Kiddo, while people are answering that in the chat box, we also had a question come in, which was actually, I think, in reference to the witnessing diagram with the 4 squares.
Yeah.
But Debbie's asking how, or when we know how to react to trauma, and she says in parentheses, we are healthcare providers who've had a lot of birthdays. What prevention strategies can help us to set the goal to move into the green square?
You know, depending on the situation, there are many things that we can do to move from, let's say, the yellow square to the green square. In presenting the witnessing model, not just that particular content version of it, to healthcare providers in many, many parts of the world, I would say that far and away, the majority of healthcare workers have found themselves at one time or another in that yellow square, where they feel like they have insufficient either internal or external resources to do exactly what they know or imagine that they could figure out what needs to be done if they were properly resourced. And certainly in the context of COVID, we know, we are hearing this, reading about this, so many healthcare workers are feeling aware but disempowered from being able to maximally provide care for patients because they are under-resourced in terms of PPE. So there are different strategies if the difficulty with resources has to do with something that you think is personal to you, is organizational, is institutional, is systemic. And but trying to identify what it is that's keeping somebody in the sense of being perfectly aware, but disempowered in some way, trying to figure out what the factors are, the multiple factors are, and then kind of brainstorming either with yourself or with other people about what would move you up into the green square. One of the things that I said in an earlier webinar, which is true, is that your brain doesn't know whether you've solved the biggest problem of all. Your brain is aware of whether or not you are feeling empowered. And it turns out that even kind of subsets of the primary goal tend to make us feel physiologically and psychologically better, provide energy for more work on creating systemic change. So that would be a short answer. I've written a book about how to move from the yellow square into the green square. Are you getting, what kinds of?
Yes, and we're getting lots of responses, and everybody is saying that or the folks that have responded, I'll say, have said that it is a familiar feeling to them. That, and one person remarked that she had a friend withdraw completely when she was in crisis.
Yeah, so that's, I think, it's not an uncommon experience. In fact, it's a common experience. And I have 5 grandchildren, and I'm kind of interested in the development of empathy through compassion. And I can see that some of the littler children, grandchildren, are having they're very empathic, but they also are they experience personal distress, and they tend to take care of themselves rather than the other person. So there's sort of a developmental situation. And then of course in adulthood, people can get overwhelmed by other people's sorrow. And again, that's really one of the reasons for looking at that square, is because we're the witnessing grid. We're trying to move up from the yellow into the green square. And that's really what I'm hoping. There are going to be some resources that people will take away from this webinar about how to do that, the kinds of things we can do. So this also seems to me to be an important kind of context marker for what's going on now. If we think of the pandemic as a disaster, which I think, or catastrophe, most people would, we can see that there was a point in time where we were in a kind of a heroic phase, particularly healthcare workers. There was a honeymoon phase, but we aren't there anymore. And not only are we in the phase that would be called the disillusionment phase, and there are many reasons even before this murder that we were there, of which the PPE situation is certainly one. But we now have had the murder. We've also had information about the disproportionate numbers of Black and Latinx and Pacific Islanders, and as it happens, elderly also, who are dying from the pandemic. But we've had a triggering event, which you can see on the slide. And the triggering events create sort of further jolting, if you will, in people's experience. So we are deep into the disillusionment phase with, in some instances, multiple triggering events, which create a lot of intensity. So this is a slide from the Schwartz Center, which I think is an interesting way of thinking about types of stress or distress injuries. They use that word, but I mean, those are sort of situations that people are in. So there's a traumatic injury that when there's a life threat or being a witness to. And obviously we've all had that. We've had that, for the last few months in terms of COVID, and we certainly have had that since May 25th. There are grief injuries due to losses of people, things, parts of yourself. And by parts of yourself, it can be even states of mind that are difficult to recover or have right now. There are conflicts. I'm not sure why they're calling it an inner conflict, but moral injury is something that I've been thinking about a great deal. And that has to do when we are witnesses to, or even are in situations where we have to participate in and therefore behave in ways ourselves that violate our moral values. And then there's just the plain wear and tear, the exhaustion due to the accumulation of stress from multiple sources over time without there being sufficient rest and recovery. And I would say that in the last month, we've had many people have been exposed to all of these 4 causes of stress injury. So actually, maybe we just pause here for a moment and get a kind of a yes, no. Does that ring true that there are these 4 causes of stress injury and we're exposed to it? We have, these are the injuries, the distress that we're experiencing. Just see whether people are saying, yeah, that's the case.
We're getting yeses in. A thank you from Maria. Yes, Tammy says, yes, this has been very stressful. Absolutely. So,
it's unusual. One of the reasons why there are these 4 categories is because under more normal circumstances, it's possible for an individual to say, oh, I'm having I'm experiencing moral injury, or I'm fatigued. It's actually unusual for let's say for me to imagine that for most people, they're having all 4 of these at once. That's not common. And I think it says something about this particular moment that we're in and just how incredibly stressful it is. So it's stressful, the individual, it's stressful biologically and psychologically, and it's stressful interpersonally. And we know it's stressful systemically, spiritually, and just, kind of in every dimension you can imagine. Yes, it is really stressful. So people have a wide array of sensations in their body when they're under stress. And you can take a look at these. Most people don't have all of them. And I think most people, when you kind of read through this, you realize, oh yeah, I have that type, but I'm not that type. I've had this, but I don't have that. Most of us over time, we kind of get a sense of the way our body reacts to stress, what it feels like. And then there are psychological experiences that have to do with stress. And again, most people don't have every one of these, but they tend to have some of these. People who tend to experience distress as anger, that's how it's going to come out in a number of situations. People who tend towards sadness or numbing, that's typically how they're going to respond. And then there are stress indicators. So Again, it's a long list. It's not meant to be exhaustive. Other people have other indicators for you personally. But if you take a look at it, you might find yourself here, or you might find somebody who you're thinking about, colleague, family member, or a friend. And some of these maybe look quite familiar to you. Sorry. Now, in the context of COVID, we know that there are very kind of typical sets of ways that people feel, that there's anxiety about one's own health or well-being and other people's, that there's grief in relation to losses, which are considerable. And again, none of this is meant to be exhaustive. It's all suggestive. People feel helpless, and confidence levels have dropped. And people have lost confidence in the system that you're working in or involved in is effective, sufficiently effective. And then people feel anger, and we know now, putting the current moment in, that people are absolutely enraged. And then there's this other kind of parameter of feeling guilt. There have been very moving pieces about healthcare workers, nurses in particular, being terrified that they're going to bring COVID home to family members. Other people feel guilt because they're not able to do as much as they want, or they don't want to work because they're afraid, and then they feel guilty about that. Some people have described feeling guilty because they aren't feeling enough empathy, and also feeling bad because people aren't coping the way they feel that they should. So again, I'm going to pause and see whether any of these sort of categories of stress, anger, guilt, anxiety, grief, depression, helplessness, confidence. Just again, if you want to just throw into the chat whether all or some of these are particularly problematic.
There are some responses that people have put in. Debbie is talking about the wear and tear is compounded by isolation from all aspects of our pre-COVID lives.
Yes.
Seeing what's going on in our country is adding to stress. Some feeling helpless to support friends, especially as a white woman, feeling what an appropriate response is. Tammy also says that her son is a doctor and lives in a different state, and he's working with COVID patients, so it's stressful worrying about him.
Yeah.
Rebecca says anxiety is at the top of the list. So
I think what we see in what you are saying, and I would absolutely agree, is that there are these intersections where worried about whether or not we can be a good enough friend to a person of color. We're worried about a child who is exposed to COVID. Could be worried about a child who's an essential worker of any sort who's being exposed. And so we are dealing with our own experience of the pandemic and racism in this country and the events, as well as taking on and feeling empathy toward or worry about people we care about. And that's kind of compounds, intensifies our own situation. Moral injury is something that more and more people are really framing as a issue. So the fact that some people in some communities, there aren't enough resources and they actually have to be triaged, and only some people get the resources, and that whether that's a patient who is not getting a ventilator or a healthcare worker who's not getting an N95 mask, it produces moral injury when either we are the person who is not able to provide the resources, or we are the person who's working under conditions where a system, an institution, is not providing the resources. That would just be one example. Some people have said that not being able to save a particular patient has in the context of COVID has had a different meaning than it does under usual circumstances, where healthcare workers are more accustomed to some people survive and some people don't, and you do your best. When you can't say that you're in a system that has allowed you to do your best, it's harder to incorporate and manage feelings about not saving a particular patient. So why is support necessary? And again, you wouldn't be on this webinar if you didn't know exactly why. But just to, put the point on it, support's necessary because these losses that we've been talking about, these injuries, can make somebody be less functional or even dysfunctional. There are also forms of suffering. And it's often hard for someone who is suffering to recognize that they're suffering. And even if they do recognize it, it may be hard to ask for help. And so, again, one of the things that we are doing, or we are aware of, is that we may be near people or know, even through the isolation, realize that people are suffering, and yet be aware that they're having difficulty naming it and asking for help. And so part of what we're doing here is figuring out, well, how do we offer support in a way that would be useful? So again, why would it be hard to ask for help? Well, the helper shouldn't need help is certainly one reason that people would say. I'm the kind of person who, I help others, I don't ask for help. You'll think less of me if I ask for help. And, oh no, I don't need help. Others need more help than I do, or need help more than I do. So what else have you heard about why somebody who might reject support when you're pretty clear that they need support? What have you heard?
And Kita, while people are typing those in, we have some really incredible comments coming in through the chat box. I'll just, a couple of them for you to think about, but Mary is talking about situations where she you consider yourself a pretty strong individual, that are just about breaking you, is what she's saying. So I think, well, you can interpret that. Wanda's also talking about being fearful of inadvertently being exposed to COVID and then transferring that to household members, especially the possibility for her daughter and grandchild who have asthma.
There's a really moving article in the New York Times yesterday about nurses saying that the only place that they feel safe is in their cars. That going home, or after a shift, that going home is terrifying. And yes, this person who talked about thinking of herself as a strong person, but this is breaking her, I think that is absolutely an experience that people are having. And what may distinguish this person is that she is whoever you are acknowledging it. But for so many people who are used to thinking of themselves as can do, function no matter what, this intersection in this moment is just overwhelmingly difficult.
And then we have a number of responses in to your question about what people might say. Others need help more than I do. I
Yeah.
just need sleep, physical or mental, emotional needs.
Mhm.
I would think less of myself if I asked for help. Somebody has to be the strong one. People say that they'd rather the resources go toward more vulnerable people.
Yeah.
It's fine. I just have to do it.
Yes,
So
these are both, in a way, these are noble sentiments, but they also are likely to get in the way of somebody getting the assistance that they need. And so this is a barrier for you as the support person. This is one of the barriers to offer support. And we're going to kind of look at, well, what do we do about these when there are these barriers?
I think just a couple more to highlight. Debbie points out that sometimes cultures dictate how we should address or not address the need for help. And her example is military families, which that's very interesting for me because that's not a kind of a cohort of people that I work with typically. But I think that's an interesting point.
Yes, and I mean there's so much cultural variation. I mean I'm thinking of a couple of films that depict military culture during the Vietnam War. I know that dates me. About what a version of stiff upper lip and how you have to be strong no matter what. But there are also cultural variations that are, subcultures or where asking for help is also gendered. There are many, many, many ways that people have of defending themselves against a sense of either their own helplessness or somehow seeing it as a flaw if you ask for help. I mean, we know this in the mental health field, that there's so many barriers for people to say this is a mental health, this is a psychological problem. There are so many cultures, military being one, where, I mean, you're almost saying, I'm going to ostracize myself if I acknowledge that I cannot cope. But the truth of the matter is that for any person, there is a situation in which they're not going to be able to cope. And for many people, they have hit the wall. This is that moment. So this is something that the Marine Corps and Navy use to identify a stress continuum. And we're going to look at these colors. We're going to look specifically at the orange colored column a few slides from now. So the green, this is, again, this is probably based on a traffic light. If you're in the green zone, you're ready to go, you're fine, you're managing stress. If you're in the red zone, okay, now there's a stress injury that is not going to heal without intervention. There's some diagnosable problem and something needs to happen. But there's also the yellow, that's supposed to be a yellow, and the orange zone. Most people, I would say, are in the yellow zone at least. And what becomes problematic is when you start moving into the orange zone. And if you're in the orange zone and you're open to help, okay, we can deal with that. If you're in the orange zone and you're not open to help, then that becomes a problem, not just for you, but for your colleagues, your family members, your friends. And if you are going to work and then you're sheltering in place at home and you're isolated, that becomes another situation that can be highly problematic. So stress first aid is a set of skills, and there are these 3 components. And the first thing that is necessary is to recognize when a peer or a family member or a colleague or friend has a stress injury, one of those 4, or 2 of them, or 3 of them, or 4 of them. And then act to do something, moving from just that sense of I'm aware of it, but I don't know what to do, to doing something. And if you see something that you're concerned about, you say something, either to the person themselves, and we're going to look at some things that you can say, or to a trusted support of that distressed person. And then also have a sense of what resources there might be, what you can offer, what there's available to support the person who's has a stress injury. So these are recognize, act, and know. On paper, it looks pretty simple, or on a slide, it looks pretty simple. In reality, in real life, there are often complications to the act 1. It's pretty easy, I think, for most people to recognize when somebody's in distress, has a stress injury. And any of us can inform ourselves so that we have some resources available. Making that decision to act, to move towards, to say something, to offer support in a way that is going to work, that's the part that's difficult. So here are 5 areas, if you will, that can be helpful in that act zone. Like, what is it that we want to offer? So a sense of safety, helping a person feel calmer, a sense of connection, helping them feel more competent, and also feeling hopeful. And we'll talk about what kind of hope, as opposed to hopeless. And here are some questions. So what do you do that can help foster safety in the other person? How can you help them feel that they can cope or persevere? How do you help them have more hope? And again, I'm going to look at a very particular form of hope. What can you do to help someone feel connected, and what can you do to encourage calm? So I think these are sort of arenas in which, in that green where it says act, well, okay, what are the areas in which we can act that are useful for people who are having a stress injury of some sort? We're distressed, we're upset. So I'm going to pause and see whether or not people have a sense of which category they think is either most important, or they feel it's easiest to provide, to figure out how to interact with somebody who's stressed in one of these categories. Just sort of hear, how do these strike you?
There's also a reminder from Norma, who says, even if you feel others need more help than you, that you need to remember to take care of yourself as well.
Yes, absolutely. Everything that I'm saying in this webinar is dual. Hopefully you're taking it in for yourself as well as thinking about another person. And we're going to look very specifically at self-care. What does self-care mean in this context? Are there
So some of the other things, Liz is saying calm is most important to get them to a space to accept support. And then she says, wait, safety is most important, then calm. And Rosalind says, encouraging calm seems possible and easier. Helping people feel connected seems harder, given the conditions created by social distancing, remote learning, working, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And then Marianne says, listening actively helps with calming, safety, and connectedness.
Yeah, so it's interesting because the two, helping somebody feel like they can cope or persevere, and how do you help them have more hope? I think those are more difficult, and they also, in one sense, feel like the highest priority would be safety and calm, as the person said, and the second priority would be helping somebody feel that they're not alone, that you or other people are with them. And these other two, feeling like you can cope or feeling hopeful, almost do seem like they follow, ensuring that the other three are a foundation.
Do you want to hear some other ones that have come in? Or?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So Audrey says grounding to foster safety.
Mm-hmm.
And Debbie says safety and calm seem to be the most immediate activities. So again, focusing on that. Connecting, Richard says connecting someone to others in the same situation may help them feel that they can cope.
Mm-hmm.
Mary Lucille says hope. We are human after all, and it is okay to fall apart, but we need to find ways to not stay there. If we lose hope, then what is there? Wanda says self-efficacy can be challenging when they can't visualize the possibility.
Right.
And Claudia says have empathy for them, understand them and their culture.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think we're getting almost a consensus view where calm and safety are critical, and foundational connectedness leads to a sense of self-efficacy, and probably, I would say, leads to a sense of hopefulness. So as I mentioned, the orange zone stress reactions are probably particularly important to become aware of. And if we notice that somebody has really persistent negative changes in their behavior, or their behavior is just really uncharacteristic, or if they're making more mistakes, particularly on the job, or you see them, and it would be hard in the context of COVID to figure out whether somebody is becoming more isolated, since we are all, so much more isolated, or compulsive behavior, that these are points to really become more activated around moving in, acting in a supportive way. Internally, the person would feel perhaps not feeling in control, that they're not thinking as clearly, that their feelings are way intense, or they have no feelings, they're completely numb. Can feel that they're having difficulty engaging sleep changes. I've been reading some very interesting material on dream changes during this pandemic, and then withdrawal avoidance. So these are kind of orange zone indicators that, again, should encourage people to, again, overcome whatever hesitancy you have and move towards a person. This slide is a little confusing, but I'm going to try to simplify it. When people are in a very highly emotionally intense context, that may not be the best time for them to be self-reflective about the very context they're in. And it turns out that people seem to do better. They have less distress and less PTSD down the line if they use distraction techniques. And I'll look at what those are. But when you've moved out of that really high emotionally intense context into a low emotionally intense context, it turns out that being able to appraise the situation you were in, think about it, and do some emotional processing, that seems to be protective against developing PTSD. So there was a large study that was done with firefighters in a number of situations, and it came up with pretty much what I just said, that in a less emotionally intense context, distraction and reappraisal can be helpful. So in the study, firefighters use, these were kind of common distraction techniques, and drinking was one, perhaps not a maximally healthy one, but it was certainly one that was used. But the reappraisal strategies were of two kinds, and I think this is important, that when people moved out of the really emotionally intense situation and were able to be more reflective, that they could either do that reflection by thinking about what the traumatic event had been, and here are some examples: letting the self fully experience the painful emotions linked with the event. That's sort of the heart of the matter there. Or they were reflective and thinking about how the experience had led them to want to move forward. So reminding themselves that things would get better, having a focus on current goals and plans, keeping the self calm, caring for others. So there were these two forms of what are called reappraisal, I would call self-reflection, that seem to help people process, and on a statistical basis, lowered the chances of people developing PTSD from exposure to traumatic events. So now I'm going to just, I think, pause for a moment, see if there are comments that people want to make into the chat before we look at some material on resilience.
We'll see if anyone comments. At this point, there are no new ones that have come in.
Okay, so resilience is obviously tremendously important. And one of the things that I say is, you know, everyone has a strength, has strengths in a crisis. And probably the person or people that you're thinking of who need support, who you would like to support, they also have a strength. And the list here is absolutely not complete. It's not meant to be exhaustive. It's just meant to sort of spur some thinking about yourself. Well, what is my strength in this crisis period that we're in? And maybe in looking at the list, you might have others, but you could also just put in the chat the name for the strength that you think you are bringing to the current moment, how you are meeting the challenge of the current moment. Oops, sorry.
So things are coming in. Empathy, support, committing to daily exercise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Self-awareness, compassion, and faith.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Reaching out to others, faith, humor, mindfulness, compassion, support, caring,
Mhm.
reflective moments of silence,
Mhm.
persistence, faith, self-compassion.
Mhm. Yeah, so it's a wonderful list that we have here.
I like this taking time to muse, which I love. I love that idea.
Yeah.
And working with others to do something about the situation.
Mhm. So collaborative action. Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's really important to be clear for yourself. Um, One of the things that I've been doing with my grandchildren is really talking with them about how everybody has a strength that they bring to challenging situations, and that it's important to have a sense of what theirs is. And my 5-year-old said hers was imagination. And a 12-year-old grandson said that he thought picking himself up after he felt knocked down was his. Um, so again, even for children, I think it's often very kind of helpful to have either somebody describe to you what they think your strength is, or for you to sort of figure out what it is. And that, again, it forms a kind of an anchor. So all of us operate in a zone that we could name our resilient zone. And when there's a stressful event, or in our situation now, ongoing period of stress, we can get bumped out of our resilient zone. So, there's a variation in the resilient zone, but if you get bumped out, sometimes you can get stuck. You can get stuck in the high zone, which I did in the beginning of the pandemic. And I had, my thoughts were racing. I think I put speedy thoughts, that was me. Or you can get stuck in the low zone. So you're kind of numbed out, or really feeling tired, or depressed. Or you can shift between being too high or too low. What's important about this is to have some clarity about whether you or the person you are wanting to support is staying within their resilient zone, even though there's obviously some, variation within that zone, or whether they're too high or they're too low. And the reason why that's useful is because there really are a different set of resources that are helpful to somebody if they're stuck high or if they're stuck low. We're going to take a look at that. So if you're stuck high, the kinds of resources that you need are calming ones. So using breathing techniques, the butterfly hug, you could call somebody who is a comfort to you, certain kinds of music that are calming, listening to, or being in nature, or listening to running water, eating healthy comfort food, prayer. These are just examples of resources that are calming for somebody who's stuck high, outside of their resilient zone. But if you're somebody who's stuck low, you need more energetic, energizing resources. So kicking a ball, exercise, different kinds of music, calling somebody again, and praying, or different kinds of faith practice. Or it could be that you need an alternation between calming and excitation, energizing, because you're kind of moving. Your pattern is to go high, go low, go high, go low. But what's important here is that it really is possible to identify a set of resources that could be helpful. And when you're thinking about supporting a person, to really check in and think to yourself, does this person need calming or energizing, or a mixture of both? And how might I be able to help them think through what they need in this moment? So I put this slide in because I know that there have been quite a number of newspaper articles about this estimate of how many additional what are called deaths of despair may occur as a consequence of the pandemic, and now maybe also people's distress about the events that have unfolded more recently or over the last 400 years, depending on your perspective. And at the high end, an estimate has been kind of floated that there may be an additional 154,000 deaths related to a slow recovery and therefore the impact of unemployment on deaths of despair. That's a very distressing idea and prediction. And the phrase deaths of despair was developed by two researchers who have published a book called Deaths of Despair. And they had a piece June 1st in the Washington Post, Ann Case, and I think it's Andrew Deaton, who said that actually they disagree with those predictions, that a wave of deaths of despair is highly unlikely. I found this very relieving, that recessions are incredibly costly because they disrupt people's lives and they deprive them of work and income, which we're absolutely seeing, and make it much more difficult to do things that make life worth living. And they're saying we absolutely need to find safe ways of getting back to work. But we should not scare ourselves with nightmares about tens of thousands of additional suicides or drug overdoses. So that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, I do think that there are some people who are so upset that they may, in fact, be having suicidal thoughts. And as a friend or supporter or family member or colleague, it is something that we need to be aware of could happen. So I wanted to have just one slide about kind of looking at a framework for understanding something about suicide. How do they occur? And I found that this kind of outline was helpful in thinking about it, that there could be an underlying vulnerability, and then there's a stress event. And we are certainly in a stress event, which produces an acute mood change. And then there are two, columns, if you will. And what I wanted to point out was that what inhibits the despair, anxiety, dread, hopelessness, anger, despair, stress, and inhibits a suicide attempt is support and the presence of others. And those are two things that we can do something about, that we can be present for people. We can provide that kind of support. Being alone is a facilitating condition. And, you know, obviously the conditions of the pandemic and the isolation that people are feeling is a concerning context. But as individuals, knowing people who are distressed, if we do have concerns, there are many resources, and there is a resource handout that will be part of the resources you will get at the end of this webinar that give you phone numbers and ways of thinking about intervening with and helping somebody who you think could be suicidal. So I'm going to pause. There we go. Any comments coming in?
Yeah, Debbie has a couple different ones. She is wondering, when we suggest to people that people should write about their thoughts, what zone are they in, too high or too low?
I'm not sure I understand.
Sort of, I think it's encouraging people to write down what their thoughts are. And would you, perhaps the question is, is that something you would suggest for someone who is either too high or too low in the?
Yeah, so writing, there's been some really interesting information, research done on the benefits of writing, actually writing about anything. And it turns out that writing where you're either being self-reflective or describing something tends to be very organizing for people, and to be something that builds resilience. And I think if writing becomes compulsive and part of, you're stuck too high and then you're writing and you're doing it compulsively and you can't stop writing, then it's not calming and it's not helping you move into your resilience zone. That would be a difficulty. But if you're using writing as a means of organizing yourself, reflection, even distraction, writing a paragraph about a fantasy of a utopian world that you wish you could be living in, any of that I could imagine being very helpful. I'm somebody who writes, I don't keep a journal, but I write every day, and I really don't know how I would keep myself sane if I didn't.
There's some other people who've commented on the power of writing. Cynthia also, it just says support groups online. I don't know, Cynthia, if that's a question or a suggestion. But Kata, what are your thoughts there?
There are support groups online. The Witness to Witness program offers peer support groups, but there are many places that are offering support groups online. So much of what we're doing these days is online, and will continue to be. And support groups online, these kind of virtual support communities, are turning out to be very powerful for people. So yes, absolutely. And that's a good resource to suggest for somebody who needs help. So I want to just move through these slides quickly. It's kind of an organization of types of comments. So they're reflective comments that if somebody's upset, you might say, from what you're saying, I can see how you might, or it sounds like you're saying, or you seem really, or you're reflecting back to the person what you feel you've heard them say. And there are also supportive comments, like, no wonder you feel, or it sounds really hard, or it sounds like you're being hard on yourself. So those are supportive comments that can be very helpful. And some suggestions, and again, this is all going to be available to you. When you're trying to build a connection, that everybody has their own ways of coping, and you're trying to show respect for anybody's way of coping, and at the same time offer not so much suggestions, but to see whether there's something that you could do. One of the handouts that I did at the very beginning of the pandemic, when we were beginning to shelter in place, was to talk about how useful it is to have a buddy system. And it's also when you suggest that you and somebody else just be buddies and check in with each other, it's a way of kind of normalizing that checking in with somebody, sharing how you're feeling. It's just part of a normal process of getting through a difficult situation. one person in the chat talked about, I think it was part of a response to resilience, about self-compassion. And that is a really important quality to introduce. So it turns out that placing a person, if you sort of doing what this gentleman is doing, putting a hand on your heart, or it might be on cheeks, and have a person say, this is really hard. This is part of life, and you are not alone in this. That helping somebody find a way of holding their suffering with kindness, that is offering them self-compassion, or you modeling to somebody who you want to support that it's something you do, that you have found it necessary to do for yourself. To say, you know, I tap myself on the cheeks and I say, this is really, really hard. It's tough. You're okay. It's okay. It's awful, and you're okay. That kind of self-compassion can be very helpful. So again, somebody on the chat talked about self-care, and here are some kind of examples, you might say, of things that people would say, could say, that are about self-care. So even though I feel fine, I need to pace myself, or I'm doing enough. Actually letting someone know how effective I am can help me. And I can trust that other people will fill in when it's necessary if I can't do something. These are all examples of self-talk around self-care that we hope people are able to provide themselves. So I mentioned hope. What kind of hope? And the kind of hope that I think about is reasonable hope, which is something we do together. It's not rainbow hope. Rainbow hope is anticipating a future where your objective is in that future, whereas reasonable hope is really making sense of the present now and doing it with other people, which is what we're doing in the webinar. It's relational, it's a practice, it's something that we do. And it maintains that the future is open and uncertain, but we can influence it. And it accommodates doubt, contradictions, and despair. It's not like if I'm despairing, I can't be hopeful. Yes, you can have reasonable hope, and you can do that with other people. And it's something about having a goal and seeking the pathway to it. And again, when it's hard to figure out what the goal is and what the pathway towards it is, that's a time to be collaborating with others. And then finally, believing that the small is not trivial, that our actions have ripple effects outward, and we can never know what those might be. And an example, this is a young woman who's in the Gambia, who's making a chocolate chip banana pancake. Somebody took a photograph of her doing that, and she sent it to our daughter, who was having a crisis in her life. This is about 15 years ago, I think. And believe it or not, that picture of that friend halfway around the world saying, I'm making the pancake from the recipe you gave me that you love so much and I love so much, which gives me so much pleasure. That photograph alone, which obviously is kind of it's a pancake, but it made an enormous difference to our daughter and then to her parents, me. And I still use it. It's 15 years later. I look at it and I remember the joy, the laughter that we felt. So that's an example of a small thing that's not trivial and has had lasting effects. So never confuse a small thing you might do for someone as being trivial or not having likely meaning. Could be very meaningful, as this flipping that pancake was for our family. Same slide. The comfort in, dump out, which is kind of the heart of the matter here. And then, you know, life challenges, a lot of research to suggest that life challenges can be catalysts for the development of wisdom. And the 5 resources that are keys are being able to manage uncertainty and uncontrollability, which is certainly our circumstance now. Openness to viewing situations from multiple perspectives, being able to be reflective, having emotional sensitivity and being able to regulate our emotions, and empathy. So when we can harness these resources, they are a key to the development of wisdom, and they often kind of co-occur with tremendous distress and stress. They can be catalysts to help us turn, not every moment, but on some moments, what is stressing us into the grist, if you will, for developing wisdom. These are resources that are, again, they will be, you'll be getting these. And then finally, I wanted to end on this note. These are from murals that were produced in the last week or so in Oakland. And I think they're just incredibly beautiful and powerful. And they were painted by school children and high school kids and street artists and artists in the Oakland area coming together to make something beautiful from this incredibly painful, difficult time. And I would say they are a form of artistic wisdom, of using the terrible pain and challenge of this time to transform into artistic vision and a form of wisdom. So I know we are close to time, and I very much hope that the webinar has been helpful.
We have about 3 minutes if anyone wants to put any last comments or questions in. I do want to say Mary Lucille, 2 different occasions, supported some things you had said. She said the tapping method of coping has been very helpful to her, and that, and then later she said that she loves hope. You can be realistic and still have hope.
Absolutely.
Richard, I see your question about community health workers and helping people who are under stress from COVID-19. I think all of the suggestions that have been talked about today are ones that definitely can be applied by community health workers. And then I also would also encourage you to, if you haven't already, take a look at some of our other webinars that are looking specifically at information around COVID-19, which is also helpful in reducing stress in some instances when you can really convey sound information to people. We're getting thank yous coming in. If anyone has any last thoughts in the last minute, we always love to hear your thoughts. Marian says she finds the webinars to be very helpful, both personally and professionally.
Great, that's what we hope.
Well, Kida, do you have any last thoughts for folks before we sign off?
I just think it's so important to feel connected during this time, and physical distance doesn't have to mean emotional distance. And just having a sense that there is a community, that there are people who care, that we are going to continue to care, and we're going to work to make this a better world. I think that's important to hold on to. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Just on a logistical note, Maria, we ask that you fill out the evaluation at the conclusion of the webinar. We ask that of everybody. We really pay attention. And but Maria, to receive a certificate, we need you to fill out the evaluation. And that goes for all of you, not just Maria. Thank you, everybody. It's been lovely to spend time with you today. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.